Inviting me here. So one is for inviting me here. It's so privileged to be here. That is number one. And number two, for the amazing intro that you have given. You've been so humble about it. So really loved it. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in this. I'll directly go into the subject, but I'll just give you a preliminary look into how the slide deck is designed. So this is primarily a slide deck. I haven't done it in the workshop model, but yeah, Vikrant has been asking me to do a workshop that would be more useful and relevant. For now, we'll start with the presentation and we'll talk about it. We'll talk about the generic things that are happening around decision making, and I'll just talk about it. So in this presentation slide, this deck is actually in three parts. One is about what we do, and second is about the data-driven decision-making environment, what is critical for it, and third is on the machine learning part of it. So these are, based on the experiences that I had in the last 6 years, primarily through working with different government organizations, non-governmental organizations as well. So how data and how it can be used in the public domain for the benefit of public. From that angle, it will be largely created. So it is not much with the technical details behind it, but if you want to know anything about any of these details, you can just text me, or you can mail me, or you can reach out over here also. I'm glad to do it. So anyway, actually Vikrant gave me a wonderful introduction. So only one thing, yeah, the current portfolio, I am working on nearly 21 projects in urban development, transport and water. So I'm actually privileged that way to be working with different teams. So when I say 21 projects, you have 21 different project managers. And I work, as the data guy in that. So it gives an amazing set of experience of what people actually want and what actually is happening and what can be produced. I am saying this is that we have been in the GIS industry in India, whether it's GIS or remote sensing, whichever way you want to call this industry, geospatial or geoanalytics or whatever it is. There has been a push in the academic sector on the themes of lots of themes like machine learning or any amount of modeling or high performance computing. Everything has been in the research sector, but when it comes to the application sector, it becomes very, very different. The requests that people make are very different in the sense like the questions are different. You have lots of answers, but the questions are very different when compared to your answers. That is what I realized after in the last 6 years, and I have been tuning my research into these themes to make them more useful, rather than doing any simplistic academic research. So this presentation is a generic overview. We call it as a high-level view, which is also is a overview of where it is and what is the theme, etc. So just to give an intro about the organization that I work with, it's called World Resources Institute. It's based out of nearly right now, I think 8 or 9 countries, and offices in 8 or 9 countries. And the work, however, spans around 50 to 60 countries right now. So what do we do is that we are actually a research organization. We actually provide ideas to governments and citizens for improving the human well-being kind of things. So what does it mean is that we don't have GIS people alone. There will be GIS remote sensing experts, there will be economists, there will be urban planners, there will be hydrologists, there will be so many people from different backgrounds working together on a single topic. A single topic will be including all of them, but in the academic circle, however, we limit it to we constantly draw a small circle and make it like only GIS or remote sensing. But when it comes to whether it is flood response or whether it is urban development, there are lots of stakeholders, lots of different people, and we try to engage with all of them. And my role in that is more on the data side of things. Right. So we take all these brilliant ideas from different teams and we convert it into a working policy or a guideline or a document for the government, a roadmap it could be, and provide them with the right views so that they can, they can modify it and improve our lifestyle. That is the concept behind what WRI India does. And WRI India right now has around 300 people. And it has 3 full-time officers, one in Bangalore, Mumbai, and Delhi. So apart from that, we have also field offices in Chennai, Hyderabad, and Kochi. This is where the organization is. So within that, I work within a team called Geoanalytics. So 2-3 years ago, it was me and maybe 1 or 2 temporary consultants or someone, whoever joined at that point of time. But right now we have a very strong team. It has grown significantly in the last 1 year. Even though it was COVID time, we managed to hire a whole set of people, and we have been doing an amazing job with respect to these things. So what it is there is a certain vision for our team. That is, we are working closely with many cities across India, and we want to make sure that they are making planning and governance decisions which are, economically competitive, environmentally sustainable, and equitable. And equitable is a very, very important part that we always constantly oversee when we are looking at from the science and technology angle. And we make sure, we do that through what is called as evidence-driven policy, which is we use a lot of data analytics tools and models to inform this policy making. Right now, if you go and ask any officer or a politician why they took a particular decision, it is not based on data or tools or models. It usually will be like, this is happening there, I know that, I know on ground, I went there, etc., etc. Those are all subjective in the sense like what people want to see and what people love to see, and based on that they see what they want, and that's how they are designing policies. Now these will have lots of biases. For example, there will be a religious bias, there will be caste related bias, and so socioeconomic bias. If you ask people immediately do some data analysis based on road networks in India, everyone will take OpenStreetMap or Google Maps, etc., etc. Now, of course, we know that from our side, we know that it is underrepresented. And particularly, the level of digitization is high in urban areas, but it will be low in rural areas or poorer sections. But so when we are using data, we have to make sure that the outcomes that come out of it are not affecting people who are already suffering. So that is why equitable, as I said, very important theme. So this is our vision. This is what we want to do for geoanalytics. We want to make sure that the geoanalytics is a useful tool for achieving a lot of these planning and governance decisions. That's where I work in. So this is our approach in that. So what I do is I take remote sensing, I take GIS tools, I take big data, I take any methodology like AI and machine learning, which are methodologies, or any other ensemble models that I want to take. That is what we use. And what we do with it, we try to figure out the best methodologies using our research. Then we try to build prototype tools for the government. Why I clearly emphasize prototype is that I personally always say that Raj doing it or WRI India doing it is fine, but government should be able to do it. So I should give them examples of how to do it, not run a parallel government for them. So we build prototype tools, we create future scenario models, we create policies around it. We also do a lot of capacity building for the government. We do training sessions, of course, in the last, since 2020, actually before that, we were supposed to start our next set of training in 2020, March or April. I totally forgot the date, but of course, because of COVID and everything, we haven't done in 2020 and 21. But we do a lot of capacity building programs. Of course, you know that many of the officers are not capable of understanding GIS itself, let alone doing it, right? So we do a lot of capacity building around that. And what we are expecting as outcomes are, it results in integrated planning. That is, people begin taking decisions, with a more holistic approach. And second is informed decision making. That is, people, they make decisions based on information rather than subjective perceptions and prejudices. Then the third is improved transparency. Once you get into data, it always, I mean, as long as we are dealing with the more critical government data, we are expecting that to result in improved transparency, right? So that is the third part of it. Fourth is independent feature replication. As I said during the prototype tools while I was trying to explain it, independent feature replication is a very, very critical stuff. That is, it is not about you doing it. It is not about you are able to create it as a Python code or a ArcGIS or a QGIS model or whatever it is. It is not just about you doing it. It's about independent feature replication. It is someone else able to replicate your work and take it forward. That is very, very critical in this business. That's why we are doing capacity building for the governmental organizations. It's not about, as I said, it's not just about Raj or WRI India providing analysis for the government. It is about how government itself can take its own decision, whether I am alive or dead. It doesn't matter to me. It shouldn't matter to them. They should be able to do it. That is the concept. This is how we approach our work. As I said, we work in different. I mean, we work as a big team. Usually, data or geoanalytics is 1 out of 6. That is the ratio normally. For every project, there will be. I mean, the idea is like one person should be working on it. Usually, I'll be there as a person assisting one person. That kind of a thing will be there. So one full-time dedicated person for each project is something that we are looking at. That composition is very, very critical, I say. Reason being is that, as I was saying, that it really matters where you are coming from. What is your so whether you are if you are looking at GIS and remote sensing, you'll be always looking at data, and you'll be always looking at what is the best wavelength for this kind of an analysis, or what is the best methodology for this kind of analysis. You will be dedicating your life into that, but you will be never ever work on what is important and what is required for it, right? So it is not about whether you can do it or not, but it is about whether it should be done or not. So that is the most critical part of our work, and that is why I said 1/6 is the proportion. We always have economists and urban planners and to assist all these things. So as I said, like the data-driven decision-making component, what it is about, we produce a series of maps. Some simple examples are given over here on the left side. You can see a set of maps being prepared. So in a normal process, the number of maps can vary. The number of maps and the statistical tables that we provide vary. It could be ranging from just around 20 to sometimes. For a particular project on economic geography of Delhi, we prepared around, so far we have, I mean, it's not yet over here. So far we have prepared around 200 maps and 34 tables, I think. So yeah, so it can vary a lot between different projects. It depends on what kind of decision we are trying to influence. So we produce a set of maps, and we produce a set of valuable information. And then there will be a set of insights into these data. We provide that insights, and we tell them what should be done at what place and what could be best for them. So this, as I said, like we look into the financial angle, we look into the planning angle. We should look at every form of governance related issue. We try to take that. So it's not just about the data, but it is about a lot of angles. And then we provide it to the government. So a typical meeting, this is actually a really old slide. But the photograph was there. Not in every meeting, we are not supposed to take photographs, right? So it depends on the officer, it depends on stuff. So some places they allow us to take photographs and stuff. So in a planning conversation, we bring that and we tell them, like, what should be placed where, and whether it is fine to whether it is fine to place. Say, for example, a town wants to plan a park. What is the right place? Now you can do a simple site suitability analysis in GIS. But as I said, we bring in a lot of financial and socio-economic components into things, and we begin looking at things from that angle also, and also from the scientific angle, from the vegetation was, what is the water supply that is there. From that angle also we bring in a lot of information, and that is what that will be there in front of this planning officer, and then they'll be able to make decisions. And this is our entire decision making process. This slide has been with me for nearly 4-5 years right now, 4 years I think. 4 years I've been using it, because nothing explains this better than any other. So every conversations that we have with whether it is the local government or state government or union government, it is all influenced by this. So the nature of these meetings have been changing over time. In the beginning, we really had a challenge to explain maps. Now it has become easier and easier. Yeah, from this I'll just go into how to design a research for achieving that. Now, when I say this, it should be very clear from here. I am focusing on application-oriented geoanalytical research. It's not about what is the best methodology, whether it is accuracy is 90%, it is whether one methodology is yielding 89%, or whether another methodology is yielding 90% accuracy, or kappa statistics. And it's not just about that. At the end, I'm creating an application, right? That is the most critical part of it for me. So my first experience, I'll just say how it started. I remember doing land use land cover classification way back in 2015 or 14, somewhere around that, and I provided it to a government official. I gave them like a good map with a lot of these plus or minus, at 95% confidence interval. I can say that 400 square kilometers of Bengaluru has been in built up area, 200 square kilometers in water, etc., etc. I created all those things, and then the officer simply asked me, "What is this confidence interval you are talking about?" And it took me nearly 2 to 3 hours to explain what confidence interval was. Right. So, and then he said, is it that you're doubtful? And I said, I'm not doubtful. This is how, certain things are and certain things are not. 4 days, 5 days went on, and we never had any, real outcome out of it. And finally, we managed to change it. We changed the communication part of it, and how we can write it in a way that they understand. Right. So it is very important that when you talk, whether the other person is able to understand it. So these are critical. So from that, I'll say that there are 4 components to these researches. The first one is purpose, second one is science, third is technology, and fourth is art. Now, in my recent presentations, actually, I have split the science into data and methodology, but data analysis separately and scientific methodology separately, but these are critical. Now, these are things that are normally taught in your schools as critical to GIS. Normally, they say geoinformation science is a mix of science, technology, and art. But when I was studying, actually, I never ever considered art as an important thing. I thought it was always overrated. I always thought it was given unfair, credit, etc. But when it comes to data, with my 6 years experience, I'll say art is the most important component when it comes to making useful researches. Now I'll explain what these are in the consequence in the next few slides, and I'll tell you how I am designing it. It's not just I'm not going to say that I am the perfect one who is doing it, and I won't say that this is the perfect way to think about it. But this has been the one that has been working for me, and it has been doing wonders. That's where I am coming from. So the first one is purpose. So this is where many people don't get it. So they start a research because they are interested in a subject. Maybe that's fine. That's good. It's not a bad thing. But they always be like, I don't use this methodology. I'm going to use another methodology. Now, my question would be like, why? Why are you using that methodology? What is the advantage that it is giving? Now, there will be statistical things that you will bring it up. But what I realize is that many people do not have a purpose for why they are doing it. They really do not know. They just do research just like that. There's why are you doing it for Himachal Pradesh? I do not know. that's where data was available. Now, these kind of excuses will be that that's where the data was available. But that kind of analysis might be required more for Karnataka than Himachal Pradesh. I'm just giving an example. I'm not just saying that this is the way, but this is how people do it. They don't have any purpose to it. They just do methodologies in a more robotical fashion. And I have been very critical of it recently, very critical of it. Sometimes you don't even need GIS for certain things. But people impose technology on other people. That's my problem sometimes. For example, once we had a huge discussion on, I'm not sure if you have heard of Amma canteens in Tamil Nadu. This is a government-run service. It's a free food service kind of thing. And we were having a huge discussion. It was post implementation of it. It didn't have anything to do with the decision making around it, but we are having a huge discussion. One of the things is that the fascinating thing about it was really successful when it was started. Basically, it's giving food to people at a very low price in certain government-run restaurants, and these restaurants had to be placed in some place. Now you can bring site suitability analysis into it. You can use a lot of GIS tools to figure out where it can be placed, where it should be placed, etc., etc. So it's a costly affair, right? If I'm going to ask you to run this analysis for the entire state and identify, say, 400 locations, you will immediately say that you can do it, but it will be charging. You'll have your own charges. You want to hire GIS people, you want to have computers. You always put a huge charge to it, but the thing is, the government achieved it. Achieved the success without using any GIS itself. That is, they simply put it next to the bus stand, where people were. Just an example. In certain places, they just put it next to the bus stand. That's where people congregate, and it didn't require any analysis. It just required a little bit of thought process. So in certain places, you don't even require GIS and remote sensing or whatsoever. So you have to be clear about the purpose. It is about what is the value that you are going to add. So that has to be very clearly defined. When you start a research, you have to sit for a few minutes and clearly say, like, why am I doing this? What is the outcome that I'm expecting out of it? You can do it for fun. You can do it for your entertainment. There is no trouble into it. But you shouldn't impose technology on other people, because that is very, very problematic in many senses. Okay. So let me talk about this. For example, land surface temperature, as many of you might have worked on it. I have been working on it for 5 years right now. Land surface temperature calculations are pretty straightforward when it comes to lands. I think the new Landsat products are coming with the land surface temperature calculations itself. But back in the day, we were writing methodologies to it. Right now, this is a Google Earth Engine code for me, and I just have to run it for any place I'll be able to get it. Producing this map, producing this visualization, I had to tell a story. I had to be very clear what is the purpose. It's not just about the heat and this place is hot, that place is hot, etc. It is not just about that. I had to tell them this is actually for a post-harvest period. So you can see that some of the fallow agricultural lands are really hot. So I wanted to tell a story very clearly. So for me, the left side visualization is very, very important. Can you see it over here in the left side? This is Bangalore, by the way. So in the left side, it says Jayanagar, it shows Lalbagh, it shows Shantinagar bus depot, Langford town, and Kalasipalayam. So now this is very critical for you. So why it is number one, I mixed two data sets. One is the building footprints which I had created, and the other is the land surface temperature. And now I'm going to tell people that big tar and concrete structures like the Shantinagar bus depot or low income neighborhoods like Kalasipalayam are really hot. You can see how red it is. It is really hot. Whereas Langford town or Jayanagar, which are a little bit richer neighborhoods, are actually cooler. This is because they have streets lined with trees and so on and so forth. And the roofing materials also that they use is very different. Land surface temperature is about interaction of object, not necessarily about the air temperature. So this is one level of information. This is not the only information that we talk about in heat, but this is one information. But why I'm saying that this is important is from this, the story I'm going to tell, the purpose for me is to figure out whether the rich people are having better services when compared to the poorer people. So why it matters is when someone is going to start a tree planting campaign, when someone is going to say that road designs are going to be reworked, then what is the neighborhood that you want to work in? So that purpose for me was clear at that point. So I said, my point was like, don't focus on Langford Town, Jayanagar. I mean, their initial plan was like somewhere in Bangalore. They didn't have any point. But when we went with the data, we were very clear. This is the purpose. You have to be very clear that the areas which are red require more intervention than the areas with green. So you have to be very clear about it. And that is the purpose that we had designed these maps and analysis for. Same thing done for Mumbai. This is a better visualization, of course. And I mean, this is only vegetation that has been visualized. So again, the same thing was like, the conversation was somewhere in Mumbai, they wanted to start a tree plantation campaign. And we were like specific on where it has to be, etc., etc. Now, remember that we are not pushing tree plantation. Tree plantation is a complex thing. What we are suggesting is intervention where we are making, effects due to urbanization. That is, we are trying to offset effects due to concrete and tar. That is what we are doing. I mean, we are not interested in planting trees as such. We normally, what we do is we try to restore the ecosystem, not create another artificial system. Planting trees is an artificial one. You can call tree as a natural one or whatsoever, but planting trees is an artificial activity. Planting trees in places which it hadn't naturally done it by itself is a artificial activity. But why we do that is to offset certain urbanization effects. So, for example, as I said, like heat island is one of the effects of urban islands. So we try to. So in that we purpose this. This is a very simple NDVI map. So for government, actually, this is very critical. I mean, to understand what it is and everything. So a simple NDVI and the land surface temperature correlation, you can see it in that chart, how it has changed. So this is how we start to influence decision making. Now we are saying, like, certain wards in Mumbai are having low vegetation and are having higher surface temperature. Of course, they are correlated. We know that. But when a policy, making, when it comes to that level, it shouldn't be at a corporation level. It should go into the specific wards. Find out the wards, Ward B and C in South Mumbai. You need to focus on that. Those kind of things we bring. So this is the purpose, right? So purpose has to be clearly defined. Only when the purpose is defined, we would be able to make it's not about the complex methodologies. It's never about complex methodologies. It's about the purpose. So the second part is science. Now you might, as I said, like purpose is very, very important, and followed by it. See, without a purpose, what will happen is that your research will become more like any other file in a government office. Once it is done, it will go into the garbage can. That's it. And it's of no use if the purpose is not addressed. Second is very critical from as a technologist point of view, from the people who are providing these insights. Science is very, very critical. There are two components into science. One is the data aspect and the other is methodology aspect. So first is we have to talk about data. This is something that we don't talk about it in Indian context. At least India is a data deficit country. Always remember this. India is a data deficit country. When we say data deficiency is there, it is not deficit in a spatially equal manner. In some places, data will be available at a higher level. In some places, it will be available at a very lower level. You can take an example with COVID itself. Any map that is prepared on COVID cases or COVID death is simply useless. The reason being is that we don't have a consistent method for collecting this data, and it is not done consistent. Even if we have it, I mean, even if the methodology is somewhat well defined in certain places, the collection procedures are not well executed. So basically what you have is underreporting in every place, right? So there is nothing uniform about it. So data deficiency is something that you have to be very clear about when you do any form of analysis. You shouldn't say that there should not be an excuse in any of the GIS and remote sensing practice that this is the amount of data available, so I'll do this research with it. No, it will be garbage. I always say that this is garbage. That research that doesn't address scientific aspect of it is garbage. Basically, it is it can be a beautiful garbage if it addresses art, but it's still a garbage. So you have to be very clear about the certain things. Geospatial data is about representation of ground reality. You have to be very clear about this sentence. It is about representing the ground. It is not about what you have. It is not about what is the data that the software takes. It is not about what data is available in what format. It is not important about that. Your data has to represent ground reality. If it is not, then it has to be, you shouldn't do it. That's my point. So second point is very clear. In exploratory data analysis, it's always required. No, don't step into any project without doing exploratory data analysis. It is very much required. You have to be clear on what you are talking about. It's not about, as I said, like it's not about the beautiful fancy analysis. It's about what purpose it's doing it. I have seen a lot of people, wasting their time. Without doing this exploratory data analysis, but you should also be aware that it is not sufficient. It is a statistical method to understand your data, but you have to understand about the ground also very clearly. This is what is keeping me in job. That is why I'm talking about these things. I managed to connect data with ground reality. That is my role. So that's why I'm emphasizing more on these aspects rather than the technical aspects of things. Now, the third is because why I'm talking about is incomplete data produce incomplete analysis and could be harmful. Always there is, you might be using, the terminology of type 1 errors and type 2 errors and stuff. That is, you say something is going to happen or something is right, and in ground it is not. Or you will be saying that something will not happen or something is not right, and then ground it will happen. In both the ways, it's very, very, these are very, very problematic. One problem that I constantly see is with respect to climate change analysis, many people do this bathtub analytics. That is, take an elevation model, raise the sea level, and it will flood certain places. Now, actually, this is not how sea level rise is going to work. But everyone does this methodology. Now, why this is problematic is you are going to tell a government saying that these are the places that is going to be flooded and these are the places that are not going to be flooded based on the current elevation model. Maybe, when I say current elevation model, well, let's say 2000 to 2020 elevation model. The ocean dynamics is very different. There is a lot of, erosion. There is a lot of accretion that comes into place, but they don't take any of that. They just raise the water level by elevation model and they are going to give to the government. Now the problem is the government will take actions for certain places which it should not be even focusing, and it will forget other places where it should have been focusing. So it is very harmful. It affects people a lot. So you have to be very clear about whether your data is complete or incomplete. I don't care if you can get it published in Nature, or I don't care what is the impact factor of the journal that you work in. But if it doesn't come into that picture to me in front of it, saying that, that it is not matching ground reality, it's garbage. Now I'm being very modest over here. So I'll just say that just last week I had a meeting. I will not say where and what. It was a model that was produced by one of the IITs in the country. And this is what the officer said. The exact word was, that model is trash. The moment I got it, I put it in the dustbin. This is exactly the words that an officer said to us last week on Tuesday. Now, that was not developed by us. It was developed by IIT. I won't say which IIT, but this is what happened last week on Tuesday, actually. So why I'm saying that this is critical is this is why I'm saying it is critical. When it comes to decision making, it should be very, very clear about the data analysis and everything around it. So this is the most important part of data. The entire geoanalytics and research process. You will be wasting a lot of time. Sometimes don't invest on cooler methodologies, but sit and digitize if you want. Like Vikrant was saying about the data creation part. Right now, I'm in the verge of creating the village boundaries for the entire country, which is 6 lakh village boundaries, right? 6 lakh village boundaries. I sat and I digitized. I could have done automation, but I was not interested in automation. I am a very good Python programmer, but I haven't done automation. The reason being is what the purpose it should serve, and the data gaps that these automation methodologies are going to produce. I am not going to take that risk. For me, it is very, very critical. Even with this digitization, it's not that very accurate. let alone an automated process, right? So it is a very important process. So please dedicate your time on it. When I said the 600 lakh, 6 lakh polygons that I was digitizing, it was started in 2016 or 17. I don't remember the exact time. So it is almost done right now. This is 2021. You can imagine how much time I am dedicating to that one single project. That is one of the many projects that we are working on. But I'm just saying that this is the kind of dedication you have to give to data and fixing the gaps. Now, if your data is insufficient, if you are not able to rationally explain why this data is behaving in this way, it can be your sample points, it can be your village boundaries, it can be your town boundaries, it doesn't matter what it is. If the data is insufficient and it is not rationally explainable, gracefully exit the project. Don't keep on doing it just for the sake of doing it. If you think that there is something problematic about it, get out of it. There is nothing wrong in taking a back step, right? So I have done that many times. We have started projects and I've felt that at some point of time it's not sufficient. Instead of producing a useless project, I always tend to you know, if the vision is going to be a useless project, if there is no politics behind it, I'll exit the project. If there is politics, maybe I'll be staying in. If like it will be like something like do this so that you can get the next project or something like that. That kind of politics, if it is there, that is a different story. But I try my best to exit the projects which I do. Now the next part is we have to understand the physical process behind data collection and processing very clearly. It's not about you get the data from some website or some census, or it's not just about you know, what is that website, Data Meet, for example. So there are places where you can get a lot of data, but it is not just about getting that data and just adding it and putting it as, I mean, citing it and that kind of thing. It's not just about that. You have to understand the physical process behind data collection. That is, if it was digitized, you should know that it is digitized. If it was a machine based product, I mean, that then you have to be very clear, like what has been automated and what has not been automated. I think it was during this CoWIN app when it was launched. A lot of these things were taken by MapMyIndia. You might have seen some of the projects that were coming out of it. MapMyIndia posted some maps with you know, these vaccination centers. Now they didn't do it manually. I'll explain. I mean, there were so many errors in my own town. It marked 6 centers. 2 of them were wrong. One of them was off by 4 kilometers. The other one was not even a COVID center itself, vaccination center, and 4 of them were missing. Now this is a huge data gap. You are going to provide solutions to people saying that, you know, go to this place, go to that place, but you're having a lot of data gaps. This is nearly 40-50% error, right? So you have to be very clear about it. Now that is fine. The error is okay, but I mean, error is one part, but what you should know is, as an analyst, you should know where this data is coming from, so that you can make a valid. So why did MapMyIndia blunder? Because it took data from a single website and it geocoded it. It was not a ground pipeline. That is, no officer from the ground sent a photo saying that this is the place, this is the primary health center, and this is where you can get vaccination. That was not there. Now, this means you are going to give wrong information. So you have to know, whatever research you are doing, you need to know what is the physical process behind the data collection. It's not like someone did it and I took it, IIT published it, so I'm publishing. No, it's not about that. Even if IIT does it, you need to know how they collected it and what are the possible errors in it and how it, so data propagation, so error propagation is a huge thing. It starts from the data collection process and it might come to you in a different way, right? So it's like the Chinese whisper story that in some popular movies they do it. For example, I mean, if you want it with the movie context, this movie Bombay that was released in 90s, you might go and watch it like, you know, the hero says something to a kid, the kid says to another kid, and the kid says to another kid, and finally it will end up differently with respect to the, you know, the final heroine or something like that. This is called Chinese whispers. That is, the object, the content will change once it transfers from person to person. So when you are citing work also, you have to be very clear about it. Now, when it comes to methodology of adopting it, you have to be very clear about what it does and what it is, what it can do, etc. A cool methodology doesn't mean a useful one. Remember this always. So someone brings, I mean, these words like machine learning, AI, everything is, these are like buzzwords. Everybody is like fascinated by it and they do this, that, etc. People who are working in it know that it is somewhat simplistic, but still it's a word, it's a cool word. And people means, they immediately say we are doing AI based this one, AI based that one. No, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean it's a useful one at all. So you have to be very careful about it. In a data-driven decision environment, the user point of view is more important than a slight change in accuracy statistic. Why I'm saying this is, initially we were doing one model with random forest, and we got an accuracy of some 83%. I love random forest, by the way. Personally, because it's a good balance between the amount of computing power that is required to the amount of accuracy that is required. And it's a balance, like time and everything. It's a fine balance. So I always like random forest. Random forest is my favorite machine learning. I'm not going to say that it is the most accurate one, but as I said, it's very important when to look at computation and everything, right? The time that is required and everything. Let's say a new model, something based on a Bayes classification or something like that, is going to provide, instead of 83%, it is going to create 84% accuracy, which is good, 1% increase. But I'm going to invest a year into it, or say invest 3 months or 4 months into it. Now that is completely useless, right? So does this 1% mean something to me? So that is why you have to be very clear that in a data-driven decision environment, the user point of view is more important than a slight change in accuracy statistic. That is very critical. The next part is the right choice of methodology, hence depends on resource efficiency and reproducibility. It's not just about your accuracy levels. It's not just about the coolness of it. It's not just about what it can achieve and what it cannot achieve. It's also about resource efficiency and reproducibility. That is how much computation you are having, how much human resources are you having, how much time will you take to complete this, and when will it be available, and everything around that. And it is also about reproducibility, whether another person can do it without me in charge. For example, certain models that I have created will run in my laptop perfectly because I have coded my GPU, the NVIDIA CUDA stuff into my laptop, but it won't work in my, one of my teammates' laptop because she doesn't have an NVIDIA thing. So it's about reproducibility. It's not just about me doing it and fancy researchers coming out of it. The next part is technology. Now, this is a very critical statement that is required. This is called the law of the instrument. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That is, if you are going to give a person a hammer, everything that the person is sees, whether it is a screw or whether it is a nail or whether it is a TV, everything looks like a nail, and the person wants to use the hammer on it, and that is the only tool that they can use. Why I'm saying that this sentence is, see, you shouldn't be focused on the tool, one particular tool alone. When I say tool, it can be Python, it can be a programming language like Python, or it can be a GIS software like ArcGIS or QGIS, or packages like NV, Erdas, it doesn't matter. If you are going to be reliant on only one tool, then you will not be able to answer all your questions. You have to be very, very flexible with the tool choices that you make. That is, don't worry about learning all of the tools. You can always Google about it. Google is a very good friend. You just search it. If you can't do it, you just search it. I love Python actually, but I also, when Python fails at some point, I always try to use other programming languages to overcome its deficiencies. I might use R for certain cases. So these things exist. In certain places, I actually go back to C also. So you have to be very flexible about tools, and that is very critical. That is my point with that. So flexibility about tool choice, anything can be a tool. You can make maps even with Excel. You can just put Excel sheet, you can put the numbers over there, and you can do a conditional formatting, you'll get the color. You'll get a map even if you're, as I said, like you can do it in Excel itself. You don't require GIS software sometimes itself. So anything can be a tool. So don't be very naive about tool selection. Don't be attached to it in a more religious fashion, right? So be efficient. And are chosen tools when methods really necessary. This is many people do it like, they try to show themselves as a really intelligent person. They try to show it in a more complicated fashion. But are these really necessary is an important question. And ability to replicate in the absence of the creator is absolute necessity. That is, as I said earlier, Raj might not exist tomorrow, WRI India might not exist tomorrow, but will another agency be able to replicate the same methodology? That is the critical aspect. And that should be made clear when it comes to tool choices also. It's not just about Raj executing it in Python. It's about, can anybody execute in any other tool that they can have? That is very critical. Of course, I have my personal favorites. Everyone has their favorites, but you have to, work with multitude of tools as much as possible. One of the comments that Pawan was sharing, it was about the 3D maps. To be honest, those are the simplest things that I have produced actually. What tools were used for it? Aerialod and PowerPoint. You can imagine how simplistic it is right now. Aerialod is a simple software that takes a grayscale image and converts it into 3D. And PowerPoint I used just for attaching labels to stuff. So you don't require. Of course, the base data came from Earth Engine, but but the majority of the visualization and the interpretations actually happened in PowerPoint and Aerialod. That is why Aerialod was a software that I explored in 2020. It is a very easy to use one. You can always go and check it. It is not a big software, by the way. So you can always do that. Why I'm saying that is that you have to be very flexible. Every day I try to learn something new, and that is what is keeping people like me relevant in this business. That is my thoughts around it. As I said, like, you can create a map around Excel. This is Excel sheet. You can see it in the bottom. You can see that an Excel sheet with numbers are there. Actually, it's 0 point something. It's a floating point number, and based on the number, this was what, EVA or NDVI, either of that. And then based on the numbers, the cell color was changed. The format was changed. Background colors you can change, right? So it was just changed. And when I zoomed out, and I also removed the margins of cells. That is also no border. If you click on no border and stuff like that, you will get it. And finally, you can see this map that is coming out of it. Took that screenshot of that Excel sheet, put that in PowerPoint, and that's it. You have a visualization. You are able to tell stories right now. So you don't have to be fixated about certain tools, is my point. Now, the most important component of data-driven decision-making is art and communication. Now, what does that mean is that it is not about fantastic analysis. You have an amazing, let's say that you got the purpose right. You got the science right. You got the perfect tools. Now, once you have prepared it, you should be able to tell that story to another person so that the other person can take a decision. So as I said, when I was a researcher, when I was a pure GIS and remote sensing researcher, I never thought that art is a good thing or is a required thing. But over time, I learned that it is the most important component so that you can get your messages conveyed by regular public. That is the thing. So I'll just skim through some of the simpler things. So for example, keep your maps simple, straightforward, and you have to make sure that the attention is given to the right information story that you want to push. For example, I want to talk about areas that have gone into reclamation since 1888 in Kerala. This is in Kerala, Kuttanad wetlands. So I wanted to tell, where is Kuttanad wetland? What is the area of Kuttanad wetland? And within that, what is the reclaimed land post 1888? There are two phases to it. This is the story I wanted to convey. So you can see it very clearly. The black dot shows the wetland. The red and yellow shows two phases of this reclamation. Make it very, very simple. Any person, your readers of your map are not going to be the people who are GIS or remote sensing experts. They are ordinary people who can't differentiate. A good majority of them could not say what is, if you let them on ground, they can't say what is north and what is east. Right? Sorry. So they can't say what is north and what is east. So to these people, you are going to talk about very critical things about map. You have to be very clear about what is the area that we are talking about and everything. So I added two other points that are important for it, that is Tannirmugam and Thottapalli over here. But this is how a map should convey. It should keep the most important point in the center of the map. It should talk about the story very clearly. The colors should be very clear, and that is very critical. Second is be a minimalist. This was created again in Arialod. I loved Arialod because of these simplicities. You want, I mean, this was nothing to do with any of the researches that I was doing. This is just an example for visualization. This went viral some time ago, right? So this is a very simple map of the road between Mettupalayam and Ooty in Tamil Nadu. It's a very I mean, people were asking for it. They wanted to see how elevation changes over places, etc. Keep it minimalist. You can show the Google Earth snapshot also 3D, right? But why didn't people like that, right? Because they were getting lost in the noise. They were having difficulty in understanding the trees. They were difficulty in understanding the built-up area. There was so much noise. I just removed all of them and I created this. Now, this is a minimalist version. I love being minimalist of recently. There should not be too much of text. There should be enough number of text so that people can associate themselves with and understand it. So that is where I'm coming from. So a minimalist approach for your maps. So this is another example for minimalism, right? So this is the story I wanted to say here. Of course, the Kolkata Municipal Corporation has been changed. There are 3 small wards. Anyway, the story doesn't get affected. That is where you have to be very clear. If your data is incorrect or insufficient, whether the story is getting affected, you should be knowing. So right now, the Kolkata Municipal Corporation has been modified in the southern part a little bit. It won't affect the story anyway. The concept I wanted to tell people is that the urban area of Kolkata, the massive urban agglomeration, as how the census calls it, is much larger than the municipal corporation boundary that is there. Now, this means there is a difference in planning and decision making, etc. So for that, I had to prepare a map, and this is what was prepared. So what I did was I corrected the global human settlements layer with my own land use classification. I modified it and then selected the largest urban bunch around Kolkata. So the polygons with significant area was selected and connected within a certain distance to Kolkata. That's how a very simplistic methodology. Took it and I visualized it. Now, if you can see it, what is the story I want to say? The entire city, most of the city is along the river Hooghly. The corporation is not covering all of them. This is the story I wanted to create. This is the thing I want to say. How are you going to create the planning jurisdiction? How are you going to do planning process for such a city? So you are going to have a Hooghly, you are having a separate urban body, you are having different bodies. For Chinsura, you have a different body. So how are you going to have different jurisdictions, and how are you going to do the planning process for such a city? So that is the question I wanted to take, and this is the visualization that can send that message across. And also explore different ways to represent data. It's not just about gray scales and blue scales, etc. You can be as flexible as you want. So here you can see that I used RGB, of course, is a combination of red, green, and blue, right? So I used that as a combination to create, like, because I know for sure one place itself will have all the 3 components. So it's a trivariate. It's not a bivariate or a monovariate. It's a trivariate. So for trivariate, one of the concepts is that red, green, blue can be used as a prism of colors and stuff. So now you can see the combinations very clearly. So that kind of things you can talk about. And another way of telling stories over here. As I said, I'm very minimalist. So the built-up area is in gray. The green area signifies park. Orange boundary is the old corporation. My point was, built-up area outside the corporation was not having sufficient open spaces in places where they require. That is the point I wanted to make, and it's a very simple map that I can. Sometimes lack of information itself can tell you a story. This one is one of my favorites. I really loved it because the story I wanted to tell is that municipal elections are critical for any town's well-being. And in Tamil Nadu, the municipal elections have not been conducted for nearly 5 years now. And I wanted to tell a story. So this map shows urban local bodies in Tamil Nadu, which are having elected mayors and councillors. Now, basically, no place has been marked. And I used a meme also for representation. This is for social media, by the way. This is not for an official decision-making process, but it's a pure public awareness type of thing. So anyway, so I wanted to tell them that, lack of data can also become a data. So that kind of thought process, if you have it, should be fine. Now, coming back this is how a design should be, how you should focus. That is, the purpose has to be designed, the science has to be set right, the data has to be set right, the technology has to be chosen, and the art form of it. Only then you'll be able to have a proper geoanalytical work. Now, once you're done with it, you can, if you're clear about it, then you can choose a lot of paths. Now, certain things I'll just show from the applications and use of machine learning in our context, how we had been using it, so that you'll understand how this can be done in a very application-oriented manner. Now, of course, the most simplest ones is providing land use, land cover maps, right? So that is also machine learning. People don't call it as machine learning these days, but right now machine learning is restricted to certain type of classification methodologies, but eventually everything is a supervised classification, whether it is machine learning or whether it is whatever methodology it is a supervised machine learning. That is supervised classification. That is, you give a certain set of samples and you are able to, based on the samples, the computer will study it, and based on the study that it had done, it predicts it. Predicts for every other place, right? So that is what is supervised classification. So machine learning, of course, begins with that. The simple methods, simple ones, you take a remote sensing image and you convert it and you get all the surface water change in Bangalore. Then you can have the stories, what is happening, etc. But I'm just saying that this is one of the simpler applications out of it. Second is, of course, the longer, for urbanization, same way, the same land use classification and stuff like that. Of course, with Google Earth Engine or any other software, you can easily replicate it for any number of cities. Now, I'll go into the next set of research. Now, this is fine. Land use classification using any other supervised classification technique or machine learning, it's always fine. But people know, from my previous maps, they can know where it is happening, how much it is happening, and when it is happening, right? So that is all there. But what is causing it? What is driving it was one of the questions that every single town planner was having in India. What is driving this development in this place? They wanted to understand certain concepts around it. So first is we wanted to create a certain classes of classification. We wanted to check what exactly is the driver, right? So for that, we created some 5 generic classes that is in which how cities grow. So for example, the first image, all these are samples of Bangalore, by the way. The first image shows sprawl and infill. That is, a city is there, and in between you'll have 3 or 4 plots which is not developed. Then the plots will develop at some point of time. Then there is another type of growth, that is city is expanding because of its natural growth, right? That is sprawl. Second is strategic projects. That is, they place some special economic zones or airports. These kind of strategic projects invite some kind of growth, right? That is strategic project. Next is corridors. That is, you have a highway and people start building, the first plot of it will be immediately converted into a building once there's a highway. And the second plot of it, of course, majority of them are empty. And beyond that, there will be agricultural lands or whatever the landscape was before. These cause difficulties in planning because you don't have a proper road network to serve the back, the area behind the corridor-led growth areas. The fourth is sometimes what happens is that if a big city is growing, a neighboring city grows along with it, a pairing of some sort of. And then there will be some random growth which I classified as others. So these 5 broad classes I wanted to check because the planners wanted to know where these are happening in their cities. It's not just about classifying what is built up and what is agriculture, but they wanted to do this. So for this, I applied machine learning. It's a very, these are the samples. Now I know what are these samples, etc. That is this kind of growth which is happening in the peripheries. this kind of growth which is happening next to industrial areas, this kind of growth what is happening to corridors, etc. So I began designing parameters and samples. So what can be the parameters? Distance from the core city, distance from the road, the presence of a previous project or not, whether there was any land, I mean, whether there was any town, old town, these kind of parameters. So we designed around 23 or something parameters, if I remember right. So this was done in 2018 or 17 or 18. So we designed all these parameters, and then we designed, then we created the samples. So my samples have to be very accurate, and I have to understand everything about the cities that I was studying. I created a sample base initially of, we went to 1,000, but after that we pushed it even to 3,600 samples or something like that we gave for these classes. Different classes, examples of what is a strategic project, what is a corridor-led growth, everything we gave. Like the definition that I'm giving right now, we gave it to the. So we ended up with this map. So the earlier map, what you saw was a simplified classification of land use, land cover. But now I have a set of information that could be useful for the government to understand what is driving that growth, what amount of growth is just because the city is growing in peripheries, how much of it is happening because of an economic zone or something like that. And now I can make valuable decisions out of this machine learning process. That's the concept. Now you can see how it is changing between different cities. So this is within a 50-kilometer radius what we are looking at, right? Certain cities like, say, for example, Bhopal or Bengaluru, majority of the growth has been in the peripheries. That is, the city is just naturally expanding. And in cities like Coimbatore or Mumbai, Delhi, etc., the neighboring towns are also growing. That is a very significant percentage that you have. In Coimbatore, you have Tirupur. In Delhi, you have Gurgaon, Faridabad, Ghaziabad, Noida. There are towns springing in that directions. And then in Mumbai, you have Kalyan Dombivli, Vasai Virar, Panvel, Navi Mumbai of recently, and all these dimensions come into play. So now you know what is happening in that city and what is the, from what it derives its growth. The next is strategic projects. For example, certain cities like Surat, etc., they thrive on these special economic zones. Surat has Hazira and other places where they have a lot of these big industrial activity or something. So that is there. And the fourth one, corridors. In some places, it's more or less consistent for most places, but in some places like there is a corridor-led growth also. In Chennai, you can see, for example, it has 14%. Now that is happening all along in three corridors. It's happening. One is the GST road towards Trichy, other is towards Bengaluru, and the third is towards Visakhapatnam and eventually to Kolkata. But these kind of this was very critical for understanding the planning process very clearly. So once we provided this, we began influencing the national urbanization policy, etc. So now you know what has happened in the past, how growth had developed. Let's say if I can design scenarios, I'll study the past for these parameters, and if I can predict the future, that's how we applied the next level of machine learning. Some of the details don't come out very clearly in this map, but this exercise we did in 2019. So you can see in the first map is 2019 built up area. Second map is 2030. And third is 2050, the predictions based on one business as usual scenario. Now we began playing with it. Now I don't have those maps right now, and I'm not allowed to share it also, unfortunately, so sorry. But we changed scenarios, we changed population numbers, we changed natural growth rate, we changed where the SECs would be placed, where the new roads would be coming up, and we began getting different results. And we began providing the government, see, these are the things, this is for the national capital region planning boundary folks. We began telling that this is the things. Now, now we are actually, thanks to it, we are in a bigger project. We are studying the entire region, national capital region, economic geography. We are trying to understand the economics behind stuff. I didn't add maps of it here. It's still a work under progress. Even though lots of maps are finalized, but we are not allowed to show it before publication. These are one aspects. The next is ecological aspects, right? So we wanted to focus a little bit on understanding how floodplains and things around that have changed and how they are getting affected, etc., etc. So this is Bangalore case, how a particular floodplain had been converted into built up. Why we are doing that is that it's not about just the utilization of SAR images like on top, or the GIS tools like Google Maps on the bottom to figure out where stagnation is happening, where roads are getting affected. We also wanted to do the modeling around stuff. So as you saw the earlier classification of land use and our work around floodplains, we merged both of them to create a new insight into our city. So we began saying that, how much of Bangalore is growing inside the floodplains. And then we began telling them which are the floodplains that you have to protect using these tools. So this is how we are creating this. So floodplains are created using it's an ensemble model. It's not a purely a machine learning model. It's a machine learning come an agent-based model more. From that you have the results of floodplains, and finally you have the combination of both, right? So that is how we began giving samples also, right? You should show the visualizations. So 3 points on the right where we were showing that the floodplains are this, that, etc., and 3 points where flooding had happened in Bangalore, and we began telling them why these decisions are important. This is why your data is critical. You have to know the ground reality of stuff. Similarly, what we did was a massive GIS come remote sensing exercise to bring the elevation model for Mumbai and the terrain of Mumbai. And I won't go into the details of it. I'm not allowed to, but I won't go into the details of it. So we began running flood models and simulations into it. I have a better visualization, but unfortunately I haven't added over here. But so the end product of it, we began giving it to the government. We have started now actually to give it to the government. We'll be actively working during this season and the next season with the Mumbai Corporation on identification and solving of flood related issues in Mumbai. I'm not sure how successful it will be. We are just starting about it, but I can just say that we have started with all this. So we began identifying some critical spots, stagnations on roads, metro stations where it is getting affected, railway lines where it is getting flooded. As you know, many of you might know Mumbai, when it starts to flood, the train services also stop running, etc. So we began identifying all these stories behind it, and this is how we provide, right? So so this flood model is actually an agent-based model. It works on it uses elevation model. It uses precipitation. It allows you to model your own precipitation rates and everything. Right now, it's a very Gaussian distribution type of model for precipitation. And then it uses elevation, of course, then the building footprints, then the stormwater drains, then I'm saying something, soil type. So all these data sets are taken into account, and it starts to run. The actual resolution of the model is actually 1 meter, but for visualization, I'm allowed to show a 30-meter resolution of it. So this one, what you see over here, is a 30-meter version of the 1 meter results. Actually, the 30-meter one is a generalized one. We have a much better one. Of course, it has its own limitations also, but yeah, it's much better in certain decision-making capacities. So you can see this is from Ghatkopar, between Ghatkopar and the airport, international airport. You can see how some of the areas that have been, that are prone to flooding, and what are the issues that we are seeing. So one problem is say that with respect to airport, why it is getting flooded is because the Methi River is blocked by a particular because of the runway, it is blocking, etc. In 2 places it blocks. Actually, in one it is full blockage, and the other it is creating a curvature. So this is how we produce solutions, and we produce stuff to the government. So it's I didn't go into the technical details of any of these tools for now, but maybe something that I'll do it for future. But I just wanted to give you a context of where it is, so that the next time when we connect or something of that sort, you'd be able to understand where I am coming from and why I am doing it, and what we are going to achieve with this. So those kind of things, just to give you a context of where it is, it's a very high level presentation for now. I'll end this over here. I think I'm on time. We have 10 minutes more. I think we can start, have a discussion or something like that.